Our first adjustment is going to be a seated occiput for a left rotation restriction. So to start off with, patient, can get my hand in your head, is that okay? So I'm going to put one finger on the mastoid and one finger on the occiput, one finger on the transverse process, and I'm going to overpressure and feeling for springiness. There's a loss of springiness, so I'm going to have patient seated. I'm going to stand behind the patient towards the side of dysfunction. I'm going to place an index contact on the mastoid process with my thumb on the temple. My indifferent hand is going to be running down the head. I'm going to set the patient into the lateral flexion, and I'm going to rotate the patient. I'm going to step forward with my opposite side foot, and my line of drive is going to be P to A. We're going to move on to supine right TMJ pisiform condyle for long axis restriction. So patient, if I could have you sit or lay down face up for me, please. Table up. Head is comfortable for you? Mm-hmm. All right, so I am going to feel in the anterior ear, and I'm going to have the patient open and close his jaw. And then I'm going to feel if there's a lack of opening on one side. In this case, the right side doesn't open properly. So I'm going to have the patient tip his head to the right. I'm going to stand to the left. I'm going to stand on the right side of the table. I'm going to take my caudal hand and I'm going to place a pisiform contact on the ramus of the jaw, and then I'm going to reinforce, and on my line of drive is going to be an LAD. All right, then we're going to move on to a prone T6 right rotation restriction, right lateral flexion, or right rotation restriction, right lateral flexion restriction. So patient, check that view in your stomach, please. So I am going to be, on the left side of the patient. I'm going to, the right up open up down. Actually, maybe no, we have to assess first. I'm going to have you sit at the edge of the table here, please. I am going to sit behind you, is that all right? Is it all right if I open up your gown? So I am going to do a motion palpation assessment to feel for springiness at every level. If I don't feel springiness at T6, then I am going to test for rotation and lateral flexion restrictions on both sides. And in this case, he is a right rotation restriction, right lateral flexion restriction. So if I could have you lay face down, please. Then I am going to open up the gown. I'm going to take my caudal hand. I'm going to place a pisiform contact on the right or the left T6 transverse process, and then I am going to make a fist. I'm going to take a clockwise torque. I'm going to reinforce with my cephalid hand, and my line of drive is going to be P to A. Right. Can I have you flip over on your back, please? Now we're going to move on to the supine right glenohumeral internal rotation restriction stretch adjustment. So the patient is going to be supine. I'm going to come along on the left side, or the right side of the patient, and I'm going to take his arm. I'm going to rest his elbow on my leg. I'm going to take my cephalid hand, and I'm going to put it on the bottom of his shoulder, and my caudal hand is going to go on top. I'm going to pre-stress his arm into internal rotation, and then I'm going to apply an LAD thrust 3 times. So then we're going to move on to a seated right radial head, P to A, and pronation restriction. So patient, could I have you sit up, please? And have you look towards the camera. So I am going to take the patient's arm, and I'm going to apply a P to A and an A to P force, feeling for any loss of motion of the fibular head, or the radial head. Then I'm going to take one hand, and I'm going to, my indifferent hand is going to pronate the wrist while extending the elbow, and my contact hand is going to be a thumb contact on the radial head, and as I extend the elbow, I'm going to apply a P to A thrust. All right, seated proximal carpal row flexion. So I am going to the patient's wrist. I'm going to place my thumbs on the posterior aspect of the wrist, while my fingers are going to be on the palmar side. I'm going to bring the patient into flexion, and I'm going to feel for end feel on the proximate row of carpals. In this case, the lunate is not going into flexion, so I have my fingers on the palmar surface of the patient's hand. I'm going to bring the hand into flexion with my thumbs overlapping on the lunate, and I'm going to apply a P to A thrust. Then we're going to move on to seated to supine TL junction extension restriction, starting with the patient seated at the end of the adjusting table. So patient is going to be seated at the end of the table. I am going to drive behind you. So I'm going to go behind the patient. I am going to feel for an extension or feel for any restrictions in the TL junction. In this case, I found an extension restriction at the T10 segment. So I'm going to have the patient sit there. I'm going to come around to the front of the patient. And I can give yourself a hug, please. So I'm going to wrap around. I'm going to take a fist contact on the T10 segment. My indifferent hand is going to go on the patient's arm. I'm going to lay the patient back. And I forgot to have a board. So I'm going to grab a speeder board, or not a speeder board, a thoracic board, soft side down. I'm going to place a fist contact in the T11 segment. My indifferent hand is going to overlap the patient's arm. I'm going to tip the patient's back, and my line of drive is going to be A to B. I'd ask. All right. Can I have you lay on your back, please? We're going to move on to the right hip internal rotation restriction. So, you feel my hand on your ankle, is that all right?
Yeah.
I'm going to feel for internal and external rotation. There's a lack of internal rotation, so I am going to grab the ankle, do the wax off, and then I'm going to lean back, and then with the internal rotation pre-stressed, I'm going to do a long axis traction thrust. All right, can I have you go onto your stomach, please? This is the prone P to A restriction of the right tubular head. So I'm going to raise the patient's ankle up. I'm going to grab the fibular head and I'm going to move it P to A, feeling for any restrictions. In this case, there's a P to A restriction. So I am going to take my outside hand and I'm going to place a knife edge contact on the posterior aspect of the fibular head. I'm going to place the patient's ankle on my shoulder, and then I'm going to reinforce with my indifferent hand, and my line of drive is going to be P to A. All right, then we're going to move on to the right first metacarpal dorsal plantar, plantar dorsal internal and external rotation. So, patient, could I have you flip over on your back, please, and take off your right shoe and sock. Thank you. All right, so I am going to take my thumb and my index finger of my caudal hand, and I'm going to grasp the metacarpal phalangeal joint. With my left hand, I'm going to block off the tarsal joints. I am going to test for internal, external rotation, and so then I'm feeling a lack of internal rotation, so I'm going to create internal rotation, and long axis distraction, my vector is going to be LAD while the joint is in internal rotation.